The morning sun crept over the rolling hills of southeastern Britain, illuminating a landscape on the brink of seismic change. Roman eagles glinted in the soft light, raised high by determined legionaries prepared to take a fateful step into a new theater of conquest. Stiff wind carried the scent of salt from the nearby sea, a reminder of the perilous channel crossing they had just undertaken. For years, Rome had hungered for Britain, an island realm brimming with resources and rumored riches, its various tribes fierce yet fragmented. Now, in the year 43 AD, Emperor Claudius had resolved to finish what Julius Caesar had started nearly a century before. Through cunning politics and a thirst for glory, Rome assembled legions under the command of generals who were determined to bring the island to heel. The first grand test of this campaign would be the fabled Battle of Medway, a confrontation that would prove pivotal in deciding the fate of Britain and the length of Rome's shadow over its shores. Long before this point, Britain had been a land of mystique and rumored riches in Roman lore. Julius Caesar's expeditions in 55 and 54 BC had brought fleeting glimpses of the island's potential, its fierce warriors and complicated tribal alliances. Yet these excursions had never blossomed into a full-scale conquest. Various factors, ranging from turbulent Roman politics to the complexities of subduing an island separated by the tempestuous waters of the English Channel, had delayed an all-out invasion for decades. However, time had not erased the allure and strategic value of Britannia. Its resources, from precious metals to fertile fields, promised great wealth, and many Roman elites dreamed of adding this seemingly untamed land to the empire's expanding borders. In the corridors of Roman power, Emperor Claudius recognized that a successful invasion of Britain could not only enrich the empire, but also bolster his own political standing. He was a ruler who had ascended to the purple under less than traditional circumstances. Many in the Senate considered him an unlikely emperor, given his background and perceived eccentricities. Victory in Britain would silence his detractors and inscribe his name among Rome's most formidable conquerors. Thus, with a calculated blend of diplomatic machinations and military muscle, Claudius set in motion the plan to cross the Channel in 43 AD. Legions renowned for their discipline and ferocity were placed under the command of capable generals, including the seasoned Aulus Plautius. Supporting them were auxiliary troops, specialized cavalry, archers, and lightly armored fighters from across the empire, well-versed in unconventional warfare that might prove essential in the lush and swampy terrain of Britain. Across the waters, in the heartlands of what is now southeastern England, the tribal confederations were alert, yet not uniformly prepared for the scale of the threat that was about to land on their shores. Rome's imperial propaganda and Caesar's earlier forays had already left some chieftains wary. Tribal alliances were fractious. At times, they united against a common enemy. At others, they turned on each other over grudges, land disputes, or the rich tributes offered by distant powers. Among these tribal leaders, Caratacus and his brother Togodumnus of the Catuvelauni stood out as particularly influential. Their domain was large, and their reputations were formidable. If there was any hope of uniting the tribes in meaningful resistance, these men would have to spearhead that unity. With Roman galleys approaching the British coastline under the cloak of early morning fog, Caratacus and Togodumnus scrambled to rally warriors from among the Catuvelauni, Trinovantes, and other neighboring tribes. They sought to block the Roman advance at natural choke points, aware that the foreign legions were accustomed to roads, open battlefields, and siege warfare, but perhaps less adapted to marshy, heavily wooded terrain. They planned ambushes and set up lookouts along major rivers, certain the Romans would have to cross dangerous waterways to reach the tribal heartlands. One of the largest and most significant rivers was the Medway, a sinuous barrier that could serve as a line of defense if used wisely. Meanwhile, the Roman legions made landfall in stages, quickly establishing a beachhead. They constructed temporary fortifications, set up supply depots, and mapped the surrounding countryside. Scouts ventured inland, sending back reports of the terrain, tribal movements, and possible routes of advance. The Roman military machine was disciplined and methodical. Each step was planned to ensure the legions maintained cohesion, protected their logistical lines, and pressed their advantage. Aulus Plautius was shrewd enough to realize that complacency was his enemy. He had studied Caesar's accounts of the Britons, who could appear disorganized one moment and fiercely unified the next. He was determined not to underestimate the island's defenders. Rome's first major clashes with British warriors came in skirmishes and small battles near the coastal regions. These engagements tested the Britons' mettle and the Romans' tactics on new soil. The dense forests, often wet from the island's frequent rains, provided cover for ambushes. The Britons would harass Roman columns, attacking supply lines, and then disappear into the mist. The Roman auxiliaries, particularly those recruited from regions with similar terrain, like parts of Gaul or Germania, proved indispensable. Their familiarity with woodland tactics and cavalry maneuvers helped secure the Romans' slow but steady progress inland. These early encounters also served to embolden Caratacus, who recognized that for all their discipline, Roman legions could be harried if the terrain was used effectively. Still, Rome pushed forward inexorably, establishing strategic footholds and building roads, or at least leveling clear paths through the forest where the legions marched in formation. As they moved deeper, word came of a major British force amassing near the River Medway. Recognizing that a decisive confrontation might be imminent, Aulus Plautius consolidated his army's position and marched to meet the challenge head-on. The Medway was broad, with marshy banks and swift currents, guarded by dense thickets. It presented a formidable obstacle, and behind it stood British warriors determined to halt Rome's incursion. In the eyes of both armies, this was the line between limited skirmishes and a climactic struggle that could tip the balance of the entire campaign. Caratacus and Togodumnus had spent weeks coordinating with neighboring tribes, urging them to join forces. While the British were far from unified, the threat of Roman domination inspired many to set aside old feuds, at least for the moment. Formidable warriors from various clans answered the call, gathering along the river's far bank. They were painted in swirling designs, brandishing spears, swords, and shields, chanting war cries meant to kindle courage in each other's hearts and strike fear into the Romans. They knew that if they could hold the line at Medway, they might stall the Roman advance long enough to force a negotiated settlement, or at least sow enough discord within the Roman ranks to weaken their resolve. On the Roman side, legionaries tightened their armor straps and checked their gear. Officers reminded them of the empire's might, of Rome's unstoppable record of conquest, and of the plunder and glory that awaited them once Britain fell. Auxiliary forces were readied, especially Germanic cavalry and lightly armored troops adept at fording rivers. Siege engines, while not as critical as in a fortress assault, were still on hand to provide ranged support. Every detail was scrutinized, from the formation of troops to the signals used by trumpeters to coordinate movement. The men readied themselves for a major trial of arms. When the Romans reached the banks of the Medway, they beheld a land shimmering with morning dew. Wisps of fog clung to the marshy ground, and across the water, the assembled host of British warriors stretched along the horizon. A tense hush fell over the Romans. For a moment, one could almost forget the chaos to come, lost in the quiet anticipation of a battle that would reshape the island's future. Then came the first horns, a cacophony of sound from the British side, followed by the Roman war trumpets. It was a visceral signal that the standoff was ending. Soon enough, the wetland air would be filled with the clash of iron on iron, the thunder of hooves, and the roars of men fighting for empire or independence. Although the Britons had prepared defensive positions, the Romans did not intend to engage in a simple frontal assault across the entire river. Plautius, a veteran of military campaigns, recognized that surprise and cunning might tip the scales in his favor. He dispatched auxiliaries, particularly the Germanic cavalry, reputed for their ability to swim across rivers in full gear, on a discreet crossing upstream. While the main body of legionaries created a diversion downstream, the cavalry attempted to outflank the British. Yet Caratacus had not risen to power by neglecting his own scouts. He detected unusual movements in the Roman lines and quickly dispatched units to counter these maneuvers, leading to fierce struggles in the shallows and on the far banks where the cavalry tried to gain a foothold. Amid the confusion, the main body of the Roman army began its crossing. Some legionaries waded through chest-high water, shields held overhead, while engineers hastily constructed makeshift pontoon bridges. The Britons hurled javelins, arrows, and stones at the Romans pinned in the river, turning the crossing into a treacherous gauntlet. War cries resounded on both sides. The muddy banks turned into slippery arenas of close-quarter combat. British chariots charged from the flanks, their drivers guiding the horses skillfully through the uneven terrain. Roman discipline, however, remained solid. Shield walls formed, archers and slingers replied with deadly volleys, and the heavy infantry advanced, step by bloody step, onto the enemy side of the shore. The swirling chaos of battle at Medway was marked by extraordinary feats of bravery and raw brutality. Caratacus, brandishing a spear with swirling blue war paint across his face, spurred his warriors with rallying cries that cut through the cacophony. Togodumnus, equally fierce, led a contingent of cavalry in a furious charge against a cluster of Roman auxiliaries. They fought to break the Roman lines and drive the invaders back into the water, hoping a rout would follow. However, the Romans were not so easily dislodged. Units of legionaries locked shields, forming testudo formations to protect themselves from projectiles, and methodically repelled wave after wave of British assaults. Elephantine siege towers were impractical in the swampy ground, but scorpions and ballistae still launched bolts that tore through British lines, sowing confusion and panic. Hours into the battle, the river crossing was complete enough that significant numbers of Roman troops had established a firm foothold on the British side. The Britons were forced to yield ground or risk encirclement. Caratacus urged them to keep fighting, to retreat in good order rather than flee, all the while looking for any chance to outmaneuver the Roman flanks. Skirmishes continued along the riverbanks, but the main thrust of the Roman army now moved deeper into British territory. The sheer discipline and organization of the Roman legions began to tell. Signifiers carried the legion's eagle standards forward, and the troops advanced in well-drilled formations. Meanwhile, the Britons, lacking a unified command structure to match the Romans, struggled to coordinate. Individual war bands performed valiant deeds, only to be isolated and overwhelmed. Still, the British resistance was far from broken. Even as the day wore on, Caratacus orchestrated strategic withdrawals. He knew that another full frontal collision would risk annihilation. Instead, he used the river's numerous bends, woodlands, and marshy outcroppings to launch ambushes whenever Roman patrols ventured too far from their main force. The Romans, for their part, methodically secured every mile they gained, fortifying positions, building small encampments, and ensuring supply lines remained intact. The Battle of Medway spanned days in a series of shifting engagements rather than one grand singular clash. Indeed, it was more like a campaign within a campaign, testing both the resilience of the Britons and the inexorable might of the Roman war machine. At times, the fighting reached fever pitch. Rain-soaked nights turned the ground into muck, making movement difficult. Fires glowed in the gloom, marking the locations of scattered camps. Roman centurions barked orders, discipline etched into every syllable. British druids prayed to their deities for deliverance, lighting torches in sacred groves to invoke blessings upon their warriors. The swirling darkness, illuminated by lightning and the flash of steel, lent a surreal backdrop to each confrontation. Warriors fell in droves, the soggy fields stained red with blood, as each side vied to tip the balance in their favor. Amid these ferocious clashes, a legend was born around a contingent of Batavian auxiliaries fighting for Rome. These fierce warriors, originally from regions near the Rhine, were renowned swimmers and skilled in amphibious warfare. During a critical phase of the battle, they executed a daring nighttime crossing upstream, diving into the frigid waters with minimal gear. Emerging on the far shore, they infiltrated British positions under cover of darkness, sowing confusion in the rear. Their stealthy action forced the Britons to redeploy troops, weakening their lines facing the main Roman contingent. When dawn broke, the Britons found themselves encircled in sections. This maneuver became a turning point, demonstrating that the Romans were not merely brutes relying on brute force, but a sophisticated military power capable of adaptive tactics. In the midst of these maneuvers, Togodumnus is said to have been mortally wounded. Accounts vary as to how he fell. Some say he was speared while leading a cavalry charge. Others claim a Roman archer's arrow found its mark during a nighttime raid. Regardless, the loss of Togodumnus was a profound blow to British morale. He had been a towering figure in the coalition against Rome, and his death caused turmoil among the tribes. Many warriors felt the sting of grief and a rising tide of desperation. Caratacus, burning with resolve and sorrow, vowed vengeance, urging the Britons to rally anew. Yet the fracturing of tribal unity was evident. Some clans began to consider negotiations or submission to Rome, fearing further losses. Aulus Plautius recognized that British resistance had been severely weakened by Togodumnus's death. He pressed the advantage, coordinating with his sub-commanders to drive the Britons back, consolidate gains along the river, and pave the way for deeper incursions into the heart of the island. The Roman legions carved out a path that would eventually lead them toward the Thames and beyond. Still, Claudius was not complacent. He knew Caratacus was an adept leader, and that these islanders, though battered, remained dangerous. Victory at Medway did not mean the entire conquest of Britain was assured. It merely opened the gates to further battles, sieges, and maneuvers. When at last the greatest clashes along the Medway subsided, the cost was ghastly. Thousands of warriors lay dead or injured, scattered across fields and marshes. Roman and British dead alike were given rights by their respective comrades. Survivors bore deep scars, some physical, others mental. The once serene riverside was marred by trenches, broken weaponry, and the wreckage of war. In the Roman camps, soldiers counted their blessings, having survived a monumental engagement. In British enclaves, families wept for lost sons and husbands, forging a collective sorrow that would harden into long-lasting resentment. For Emperor Claudius, the news of the Roman success at Medway was cause for celebration. Though he was not personally leading the campaign on the front lines at its start, He would soon make his journey across the Channel, confident that the path to glory was now open. He arrived in Britain to partake in the latter stages of the conquest, bringing reinforcements and war elephants, an intimidating display meant to awe local populations. In time, the Romans would advance to the stronghold of Camulodunum, modern-day Colchester, effectively establishing a new provincial capital in Britain. Claudius's triumph would be immortalized on Roman coinage, in triumphal arches, and in the annals of the empire. For the Britons, the defeat at Medway did not translate into immediate or total submission. Caratacus, though bereaved and outnumbered, continued to resist. He would become a pivotal figure in British resistance, orchestrating guerrilla tactics and inciting tribal revolts for years to come. His legacy would endure as a symbol of defiance, even if the broader outcome of the campaign favored Rome. Subsequent battles, including the important confrontation near the Thames, reinforced the Roman foothold, but British uprisings would flare again and again, notably in the revolt led by Boudicca around 60 to 61 AD. Yet the Battle of Medway remained a watershed moment, a grand collision of arms that set the tone for much of what followed. It demonstrated Rome's capacity to wage complex, multi-layered campaigns in hostile terrain and signaled to the British tribes that they faced a formidable opponent, one who blended iron discipline with strategic cunning. In the psychological realm, Medway shattered the myth that Britain was unconquerable. Romans built upon this victory, sowing alliances with some tribes via diplomacy and punishing others who resisted, thereby fracturing any attempts at a unified British front. In the aftermath of Medway, Roman engineers and laborers wasted no time in commencing the transformation of the region. They built roads, bridging the land with strategic highways that connected Roman garrisons. Forts sprang up near critical junctures, each manned by contingents of legionaries, auxiliaries, and local auxiliaries recruited or coerced into service. Towns grew around these military outposts, creating seeds of Romano-British culture that would flourish over the decades. Markets exchanged goods, grain, livestock, metals, and local crafts for Roman coins, imported wine, olive oil, and exotic spices. While some Britons embraced these trappings of Roman civilization, others withdrew further into regions less accessible to Roman control, nurturing their age-old customs. This shifting cultural landscape was not without tension. Roman legal systems, architecture, and religious practices took root, sometimes overshadowing native traditions. Temples were erected in honor of Roman gods, but they sometimes absorbed local deities in a syncretic blend. The waters of the Medway itself, once a barrier to Roman ambition, saw the construction of new bridges and modest port facilities. Over time, the river became an artery of commerce rather than a line of defense. In short, the region that had been a bloody battlefield was being reshaped into an integrated frontier zone of the empire. Yet, for a long while after the victory, the Romans remained alert. They knew Britain was not fully subdued. The north and west remained largely independent, mountainous strongholds where tribes continued to resist. The memory of Medway was a potent rallying cry for resistance fighters who argued that if the tribes had mustered a stronger, more unified force, they might have repulsed the invaders. Skirmishes continued, especially under Caratacus's leadership, in territories that would later become Wales. Roman punitive expeditions marched across hills and valleys, building fortresses deep in enemy territory to quell any uprising. Despite these ongoing conflicts, the Roman Empire systematically tightened its grip. The political structure of Roman Britain began to coalesce, with tribal client kings allowed to rule under Roman oversight. Taxes were levied, markets thrived, and Roman law extended over ever wider swaths of the island. Urban centers like Londinium, London, began to flourish, capitalizing on maritime trade routes. Villas and baths emerged in the countryside for wealthy Roman settlers and local elites who found value in collaboration. A new generation of Britons grew up under Roman rule, fluent in Latin, and adept at navigating both Roman and Celtic identities. Had it not been for the watershed victory at the Battle of Medway, all of this might have unfolded very differently. The Romans might have faced a stalemate or withdrawal, as had happened in previous decades when the cost of conquest seemed too high. Instead, the Medway success gave the empire the momentum it needed. The psychological blow to British tribal unity was significant, and Rome exploited every subsequent opportunity to negotiate from a position of strength. Where negotiation failed, legionary steel enforced the empire's will. The deeper significance of Medway also lay in the credibility it lent to Emperor Claudius back in Rome. His critics had doubted his capacity to rule. Some saw him as physically frail or inexperienced in military affairs. However, with the conquest of Britain underway, Claudius's standing soared. Triumphal processions in the capital boasted of new lands added to the empire's vast domain. Statues were erected, coins minted, and the Senate showered honors upon him. The triumph was not solely Claudius's, of course. It was built on the blood and discipline of countless Roman soldiers and auxiliaries, as well as the strategic acumen of commanders like Plautius. But in an empire that valued spectacle and success, Claudius's name was forever entwined with the subjugation of Britain. For the Britons who lived under Roman authority, daily life became a mixture of adaptation and resentment. Some thrived under the new order, rising to positions of influence as intermediaries between the Roman administration and local communities. Others chafed under the weight of foreign rule, faced land confiscations, or were pressed into labor to build the infrastructure that serviced Rome's expanding interests. Cultural exchanges were inevitable. Roman amphitheaters hosted spectacles, some of which incorporated local traditions. British blacksmiths learned Roman metalworking techniques, creating hybrid forms of weaponry and artistry. Over generations, a Romano-British identity emerged, neither fully Roman nor purely indigenous, but a fusion that reflected the complexities of empire and resistance. Still, uprisings and rebellions would never be completely quelled. The seeds of future conflicts lay dormant, waiting for sparks. The revolt led by Boudica, Queen of the Iceni, was perhaps the most famous example of British fury. That rebellion erupted because the Romans overreached, violating treaties and brutalizing local populations. Boudica's forces sacked Roman settlements, including Londinium, before the legions rallied and crushed the uprising. Though that event was distinct from Medway, the sense of British identity forged in battles like Medway and the memory of men like Caratacus helped unify the revolt. Even so, Rome's military and logistic superiority again proved decisive. In the broad scope of history, the Battle of Medway in 43 AD stands as one of those critical flashpoints, a pivot upon which the fate of nations rested. It set into motion the Roman occupation that would last for centuries, leaving a mark on Britain's culture, infrastructure, and demography. Roads built by Roman engineers would become the foundations of modern highways. The layout of certain towns still echoes the Roman grid. Latin words seeped into local dialects, and Roman religious practices intertwined with Celtic beliefs. From a purely military standpoint, Medway exemplified Rome's capacity for combined arms warfare. Infantry, cavalry, engineering, and naval elements all worked in concert. The Romans demonstrated their hallmark organization and the ability to adapt quickly to Britain's unforgiving wetlands and forests. The Britons, for their part, displayed courage and ferocity, leveraging local geography and tribal alliances. Although they ultimately lost the battle, They left an indelible impression on Roman invaders, who never took British resistance lightly afterward. In the human dimension, the battle was a crucible of courage, sacrifice, and tragedy. Loved ones were lost, families fractured, and entire communities upended. But it also sowed seeds of new beginnings, alliances, and cultural blending. The crossing of the Medway became a symbolic crossing into a new era, where Britannia was no longer a distant rumor, but a tangible province bound to Rome's destiny, for better or worse. Monuments and inscriptions would later commemorate the Roman triumph, echoing the songs of legionaries who boasted of their conquest. In hidden groves and humble villages, Britons told another version of the story, of brave warriors who held back the mightiest empire of the age for as long as they could, and of a land whose spirit would never truly be conquered. Years turned into decades, and decades into centuries. The Roman occupation stretched northwards, establishing Hadrian's Wall and venturing briefly into Caledonia, Scotland, though never fully subduing it. In time, Rome itself would face calamities: barbarian invasions, internal strife, economic collapse. Eventually, the empire withdrew its legions from Britain early in the 5th century AD, leaving the Romano-British population to fend for itself against new waves of invaders, such as the Saxons. But the ghost of Roman Britain lingered in ruins, roads, and stories passed down through generations. The memory of the Battle of Medway, although overshadowed by later and more famous conflicts, persisted in the tapestry of Britain's historical consciousness. Medieval chroniclers might have had only fragments of the tale, but modern historians, archaeologists, and enthusiasts piece together the mosaic of that decisive clash. They explore the sites, unearth relics, and reconstruct the day that changed the island's destiny. They speak of legionaries forging their way through marshes, British chariots thundering into Roman lines, and the swirl of mist and steel that defined those tumultuous hours. Thus, the Battle of Medway in 43 AD was more than a clash of swords and shields. It was a fulcrum of historical transformation. It heralded the dawn of Roman Britain, establishing a framework for centuries of colonial rule, cultural exchange, and intermittent rebellion. It crowned Claudius with imperial glory and tested the mettle of Caratacus, forging him into a legend of resistance. It replaced illusions of British invincibility with the harsh reality of Roman tenacity. In the echoes of that confrontation, one can still discern the footfalls of legionaries crossing muddy fields and the distant war cries of Britons defending their homeland. And though the empire that orchestrated this conquest would eventually fade, the impact of that single battle resonates down the corridors of history, shaping the identity of a land once known as the edge of the Roman world. Even now, the River Medway flows quietly through its course, with modern bridges and settlements adorning its banks. People hustle through their daily routines, mostly unaware of the epic struggle that took place on those waters nearly 2 millennia ago. Yet for those who pause and reflect, the air seems to hum with distant memory. The land itself remembers, a silent custodian of wars fought, blood spilled, and destinies forged. The Roman conquest of Britain stands as a testament to humanity's capacity for empire building and resilience, with the Battle of Medway serving as a vivid, defining chapter in that grand, unending saga.